Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Cherno Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, we are here with Carleton University's Steve Saideman, and he's our NATO guy, and it's been a big NATO week, so I figured we would have a quick chat about what they discussed at the Munich conference this week, as well as the whole thing with Trump and his mobster diplomacy when it comes to NATO members. So, Steve, where did you want to start here?
I guess we could start with Trump.
Okay.
Obviously, people are not that happy about what he had to say about encouraging Russia to attack NATO allies that are underspending. Although, again, the joy of Trump is that despite how many times he's been corrected, he thinks that the 2% thing is about a tithe or a protection racket and not countries spending on their own militaries. Um, and we want to be fair to Trump in that this is mostly an applause line that he likes,
Yeah.
that he seems to work with his domestic audiences, um, that he's signaling to the far right that he is truly America first. I mean, this is the origins of this.
Hmm.
In 2016, I was confused when he kept on talking about NATO because I was like, who cares about NATO? People don't vote on foreign policy. But it became clear that this is part of what the far right cares about is isolationism, is toss away the allies. And now part of being a good far right person, not just in the United States, but in Canada and in Europe, is to be pro Putin. And so, since Russia and NATO are adversaries, best way to be pro Putin is to be anti NATO. So, I don't. I think if you take a look at the surveys of the American public, most
Hmm.
Americans are big fans of NATO. It's like 70%. But that's not what Trump cares about. He just cares about his base.
Yeah. I guess with that in mind, there's been some talk that this is possibly lighting the fire under some of the European allies that this is a warning sign we need to start stepping up. What's your kind of read on that?
Well, there's two things going on here. One is Trump is trying to take credit for all the pressure he's placed on it, but it turns out the Europeans spend more money on NATO when Russia poaches in the east. So the turnaround in defense budgets after the austerity measures of 2008 2009 was 2014 2015 in the aftermath of Russia's seizure of Crimea. And then there was more enthusiasm for spending more money on defense since when? February of 2022. What happened then? So it's more Russia's behavior than Trump. And the thing I always remind people of is that Trump is toxic to most European audiences. And so people, doing Trump's bidding are going to look bad in their own domestic politics. So as much as he'd like to take credit for pushing people to spend more money in the military, he actually, in part, creates countervailing forces about people going, well, I don't want to do what he wants.
Yeah.
On the other hand, Europeans may be thinking more about spending money in the military, not because Trump is pressuring them, but because they think that Trump and the United States won't be there when they need them. That I was on other media outlets the previous week basically saying that if Trump becomes president again, you can kiss NATO goodbye, and you probably can kiss NORAD goodbye. Um, and one of the big differences between now and then is I always downplayed the adults in the room, Jim Mattis, and all that nonsense. But it's one thing to have folks who are maybe overrated. It's another thing that the next time around, Trump will probably find the best arsonist for defense, just like he found good arsonists for education, for finance, for justice. And so I expect the next Secretary of Defense to be enthusiastic about gutting American commitments around the world. And I think the Europeans are starting to think about a plan B or a plan C. What happens if you
Yeah.
can't expect the Americans to come over the hill when the Russians start to knock on your door?
Yeah, no, for sure. I did want to touch briefly back on the 2% thing. There were some comments this week from the Secretary General of NATO about asking Canada for a timeline as to when we're going to hit our 2%. My immediate joke is, well, we could hit it next month if we crater our economy. But I know this is one of your bugaboos in terms of why this 2% metric has always been a fairly stupid one. So I'll let you explain it.
Well, again, the thing about the 2% expectation, and again, in 2014, NATO agreed to aspire to move towards 2%. They didn't by 2024. Well, it's 2024. Most countries did move towards it. Most countries did not get over it, but they got towards it. Canada, it sort of depends on how you count. Canada is
Hmm.
certainly spending more money than it has in the past on absolute measures. It's one of the biggest spenders on absolute measures within the alliance. There are other countries that are crappy allies, such as Greece, that always spend more than 2%. They spend it on the wrong things. That is, they spend it on having a large army pointed at Turkey, which is
Yeah.
not particularly useful for the alliance. Um, the government of Canada has made a series of commitments that will push us towards 2%. Buying F-35s, continue to buy the ships, NORAD modernization. Um, there's been discussion about defense cutting the budget by $1 billion, but it's cutting the growth of the defense budget by $1 billion, not cutting it so that it's actually spending less next year than the previous year.
Yeah.
And the thing is, this government and the next government, whatever it is, going to face a lot of pressure, spend more money on personnel because we don't have enough personnel. And that's going to be a major cost as well. Phil Lagasse had a nice post this week at his Substack about, well, how could we spend 2%? Well, here's the things we could do.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see what this government does, because I think this government has been focused on deficit cutting because they thought they were going to get blamed for big deficits that would be causing inflation. Well, inflation is not as much of an issue. So
Yeah.
maybe the
And
pressure to cut deficits is going to be less.
yeah, well, and the deficit was never the cause of the current bout of inflation anyway, despite the rhetoric of certain politicians. But
No, but
yes, that is a point to take. Yes.
they were falling into that argument. I always thought the liberals were much stronger ground, going, "Hey, we're going to spend more money to help our country," and this deficit stuff has been harmful to Canadians. I think they could have made a good argument with that, but I don't read their polls like they do, so I don't know. But
True enough.
um, I think Canada can get moved closer to 2% by meeting these commitments. Once we get that 35s, they're going to be expensive to upkeep. So that was one of the points that Phil was making, is that once we get all this stuff, running it's going to be very expensive too. So we could get closer, or we could get to 2%, but it would require us to have deficits. Now, the good news about Canada is we don't have constitutional restrictions on what we can do. The Germans are really tied in knots right now because they were wanting to spend more money, but they actually had their constitutional court saying you can't do that. You can't do too much deficit spending because it's unconstitutional. There's nothing stopping Canada, and given the growth of our economy the past 10 years, we're not in whatever the shape was in the 1990s. We could certainly spend more money and have bigger deficits, and it's not going to be that traumatic or damaging. It's not going to be that inflationary.
Yeah.
So it just depends on whether this government discovers its values and its courage. But the next one, Polyev has been saying he'll think about it, but he cares
They'll
more
think
about
about
deficit.
it. Conservatives really like aspirational targets that they have no intention of ever meeting,
Yes.
whether that's NATO commitments or emissions reductions.
Yeah, we can get talked about the environment. That's a completely different thing.
All right. So the other thing this week was the Munich Security Conference, which happened. There were some things that happened in there, such as the death of Navalny, and we hit the 2-year anniversary of Russia's invasion in Ukraine, and I'm just wondering if what of these things are sending signals right now for the rest of NATO?
Um, that's a good question. Uh, I'm actually in Berlin right now, and one of the major organizers of the Munich Security Conference is actually based at the Hertie School where I'm hanging out for the next 3 months. So they had a review of it on Monday, but the main speaker was actually the former Chinese Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs. So that was fascinating, but it
Hmm.
wasn't as NATO centric as you would have expected. Um, I would say, uh, Navalny's wife spoke like hours after the death was announced, and so that there was a lot of meaning attached to it. I think the people that were still buzzing over Trump stuff from the previous week I think there's probably a lot of discussion in the side rooms about how to hedge, what to do if you can't count the United States anymore. And I do actually think that the Chinese former vice minister had something really important to say. Not so much of the propaganda about how they never do anything wrong and they're constantly being plagued by others who are jealous or whatever.
Yes.
But she reminded us that American leadership, American hegemony, American domination of the world, the United States was a giver in a lot of ways. Now, so for certain parts of the world did not like what was given to them, such as bombing on Vietnam or whatever. But in terms of
Yes.
public goods, of supporting free trade, of supporting cooperation in a variety of ways, paying for a lot of cooperation, that hasn't been the American way the past 10 years. The American way from Trump and Biden too has been mostly, give us, give us, give us, not here's what we can provide. And so I think that the Americans need to think about how best to provide some cooperation in public goods, support international cooperation, because at the end of the day, that helps out the United States a lot more than having conflict with everyone around the world. So I think that was a really salient point. But right now, everybody's just mostly just watching for the American election and sincerely worried. Last time around, they had wishful thinking about, well, Trump's not going to be that bad. This time around, they know that NATO might be in an end if Trump gets elected. So I think that was probably something they talked about.
All right. Well, thanks for taking the time to do this from Berlin, and we'll talk again soon.
My pleasure, Dale.
All right. Thanks. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at journo_Dale on Twitter and journodale_no_ on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.